My name is Jessica Shand, and I'm a performer and composer with a background in math, and I'm an SJA Fellow. I really love music because it's such a community building force. It's a way to express oneself. For my SJA project, I'm working on an album that is entirely consisting of flutes that have been warped and electronically manipulated in different ways. And the idea is not to try and replicate, existing sounds, but to kind of create something uncanny that makes people think more about sensation and what feeling does that give a person, rather than a particular narrative. Then I can do something that's a little more raucous, like. So the question that's been keeping me up at night is just this modest question of, where do our aesthetic values come from? And why do we have them in the first place? How do we form them? And almost more importantly, what do they do to us and for us? How do they act recursively on us? And I haven't figured out any definite answers to that question, but what I do want to convey to you today are the possibilities that are opened when we linger with uncertainty and simply listen. So to tell you a little bit about myself, I've had the privilege of being a part of a number of different artistic and intellectual communities throughout my education, ranging from pure mathematics and computer science to music. Everything from contemporary classical music to what we call jazz and improvised music to electronic music. And something that's always really struck me is the way that these different communities have very distinct and often contradictory, even paradoxical answers to these questions about aesthetics. Just to take one example, you might consider the idea of truth and how each of these communities thinks about truth. Historically, math, we talk about the search for some kind of objective, transcendental truth, whereas if you talk to a singer-songwriter, they might be more inclined to talk about the search for some kind of inward truth, and then music as a form of self-expression of that. And even that is kind of at odds with my own experiences in music as someone who plays the flute, which is an instrument that historically has had this very close relationship with bird song and the idea of imitating and even conversing with birds. So with this, privilege, but also challenge of kind of code switching between all of these different communities, I came to a point where I really just needed to take a step back and get that bird's eye view of the relationship between the aesthetic and the scientific. And with the support of the Steve Jobs archive, I was really able to get that vantage point this past year. I started to really interrogate the origins of what we call the aesthetic and the way that it's actually very entangled with the scientific. The word aesthetic actually comes from this ancient Greek notion of aesthesis, meaning sensation or perception. And so I embarked on this series of experiments, very experimental music, treating the flute as a laboratory for sound, with all that idea about aesthesis in mind. And really thinking of music as a way to probe the boundaries of auditory perception, what's possible to hear, what's possible to feel with sound, and how those possibilities and sensibilities are distributed across different groups of people and different individuals. And so what I ended up doing was I would take these samples of myself playing some technique on the flute, and then progressively mutate them through a series of electronic transformations. And in some cases, those sounds would evoke some very surprising and specific associations and mental imagery for me, things like animal sounds, but also machine noises and even human voices. And I made the decision that in those cases, I would really just follow whatever imagery came to mind and try to fine-tune the samples until they felt like a convincing, if abstract, representation. So here are some examples of those results. This flute sound eventually became this. this flute sound, that flute sound, eventually became this. And this sound eventually became this. And in another set of cases, the sounds never really left this pre-semantic haze that was kind of hard to articulate in language, so I'll play you a couple of those as well. So as you can tell, the results varied widely, but what unified all of these experiments was that I never legislated an ending in advance. And for me, it was really about the encounter with sound and allowing those results to emerge from the encounter. And really just being open to, refusing a binary between form and formlessness, and rather just trying to both attend to the texture and feel of sound, and rejecting the temptation to need to categorize or define it, but also just enjoying the mimetic interaction between sound and language, and just following it when it did occur for me. So, where is all this going? As a flute player, I always come back to birds and bird song. And something that you may know is that migrating birds have a way of figuring out where they're going, even when a storm knocks them 100 miles off course. And it was Adrienne Marie Brown who beautifully wrote that, as for humans, some of us are surviving, following, and flocking, but others of us are trying to imagine where we go as we fly. And when it comes to my work, if there's one thing that I can achieve with it, I hope that it'll be to create openings into more humane ways of moving through the world.